Hey guys, tonight we begin the story about medieval carnage, the deadliest wars, plagues, and massacres in history. Before you comfortable like and subscribe the video, turn on fan and close the door for smooth background. So let's start the story. In a dim lit tavern nestled beside the crumbling walls of an ancient fortress, there sat an old man hunched by the hearth. His beard was long and white, his eyes weary yet burning with remembrance, and his cloak patched with years of travel. He was a chronicler, a keeper of memory, a weaver of tales both dreadful and true. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows upon the timbered beam. Around him, villagers and weary travelers leaned closer, their bowls of broth, their ale mugs resting half raised, for they knew when the old chronicler spoke, the past came alive. But children of a quieter age, the old man rasped, his voice heavy as the smoke that curled above. You live in times where the dead rest beneath consecrated earth and the reaper visits as a whisper. But once the world was different. Once the reaper strode across kingdoms with a sight so vast it felled cities. Once men's greed, zeal, and pride turned rivers red, and pestilence consumed souls by the thousands. You ask me for tales of kings and knights, but I will not give you courtly love and noble jousts. I shall speak of carnage, of the wars, the plagues, and the massacres that Europe trembling in the shadows of death. For this, my children, is the true heart of the Middle Ages. The tavern fell into silence. The old man leaned closer to the fire, his face painted by its glow, and began with his first tale, a tale of kingdoms locked in endless war. Chapter I, the Hundred Years' War, a century of blood. The year was 1337 when the drums of war began to thunder between England and France. What began as a quarrel over succession, a dispute of crowns and bloodlines, stretched into a century of carnage, leaving both kingdoms drenched in misery. The spark of war, King Edward III of England, the Fatih of England, Boldaweg of England, wishes, claimed the throne of France through his mother's lineage. The French scoffed at his demand, for they would never stomach an English king upon their soil. And so swords were drawn and armies marched, not for months, not for years, but for more than a century. Villages burned as raiding parties rode swift as wolves. French peasants watched their cottages crumble, their fields trampled under iron hoofs. English longbowmen, tall as oaks, became the terror of the battlefield. Their arrows, loosed in black clouds, pierced through armor and filled nights as if they were nothing more than deer at a hunt. Crecy, the reign of arrows, 1346. I tell you now of the Battle of Crecy, where the ground itself drank more blood than rain. The English, though outnumbered, held firm upon a hill. Their archers stood in rows, bows taller than a man, strings drawn taut with death. When the French knights charged, proud in their shining armor, the sky darkened. A hail of arrows whistled like a storm of locusts. Horses screamed, men toppled, banners fell. The nobility of France, counts, dukes, and princes, were humbled in the mud, struck down by peasants with bows. They say the blind King John of Bohemia, noble yet doomed, tied his reins to his knights, so he might ride one last charge. He was found slain upon the field, his crown in the mud, his valor wasted in vain. Thousands lay dead that day, the cries of the wounded filling the night like a dirge. And this was but the beginning. Poitiers, the captured king, 1356. A decade later came Poitiers. Once again, the English longbow ruled the field. The French, with banners proud, surged upon them but were broken. King John II of France himself was captured, dragged from the field like a common criminal. Imagine, if you will, the humiliation of a kingdom whose sovereign sat in English chains. To ransom him, they stripped their land of gold, leaving the peasants poorer than beggars while the English feasted upon the spoils. The Agincourt slaughter, 1415, but it was at Agincourt, beneath the autumn rain, that the reaper danced most cruelly. Henry VIII of England, his men weary, faced a host 5 times his number. The mud was thick, the sky grey, the air heavy with omen. The French, armored and proud, charged once more, yet the ground betrayed them. Horses sank, knights slipped, and again the English arrows fell like iron rain. The French knights, once lords of the battlefield, became prisoners of the mire, crawling like wounded beasts. It is said that so many nobles were slain that day. France's chivalry was broken for a generation. Henry's men waded through bodies, their boots thick with blood and mud. Prisoners too many to guard were executed where they knelt. The body count was staggering, thousands of France's finest gone in a single day. The cost of a century yet, mark this well, the Hundred Years' War was not merely battles, it was starvation, pillage, and plague. Mercenaries unpaid roamed like wolves, looting villages, slaughtering peasants, burning harvests. Fields once green became graveyards, cottages became ash. A chronicler of the age wrote, "The land is left desolate, the people wander in misery, and death is the only harvest." By the time the war staggered to an end in 1453, France lay in ruins, England drained of wealth, and 100 years of blood had scarred the very soul of Europe. The old man in the tavern paused, sipping from his mug, his eyes glinting with sorrow. "My children," he whispered, "if war was a beast, then in the 100 Years' War it fed like a glutton, devouring generations without end. Yet war is but one head of the hydra of death. Another, darker still, was soon to follow, the plague." And with that he leaned closer to the fire, ready to speak of the Black Death. The old chronicler's hands trembled as he warmed them by the fire. His eyes, pale with age, stared not at the tavern walls, but at the vast steppes of Asia, where horsemen rode like storm cloud, like storm cloud. He drew a long breath and spoke. "Culren, if the 100 Years' War was a beast that bled France and England, then the Mongols were no beast but the very horsemen of the apocalypse. Their hoofs thundered like judgment itself, their arrows fell as hail, and where they passed, cities ceased to exist. Not war alone, but massacre on a scale unseen before or since. The rise of Genghis Khan once, the Mongols were but scattered clans of nomads upon the steppes, herding horses and sheep, living in felt tents beneath endless skies. But in the late 12th century, there rose among them a man of destiny, Temujin, later named Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. He was born into hardship, his father poisoned, his family abandoned, his youth spent in hunger and struggle. Yet he forged loyalty with fire and iron, uniting the tribes beneath his banner. He promised his warriors not the plunder of villages alone, but the conquest of the world. And so they rode, swift as falcons, merciless as wolves. The Mongol way of war, the Mongols were not knights clad in shining armor, footmen with shields. They were horsemen, each warrior, with 3 or 4 steeds able to ride for days without rest. Their bows, short and curved, could pierce armor at 200 paces. They fought with cunning. They feigned retreat, luring foes into pursuit, then turned with sudden fury to slaughter them. Their messengers, swift as the wind, carried orders across vast lands. Their cruelty, deliberate and planned, struck terror before their armies even arrived. The Khwarezmian tragedy 1219-1221. Genghis first tested his wrath upon the empire of Kayism, a wealthy land of cities and trade. He sought peace, sending merchants and envoys. But the Shah of Khwarezm, proud and foolish, murdered the envoys and seized their. They wore strange masks of leather with beaked noses stuffed with herbs, the first plague doctors. But their remedies availed nothing. The air itself seemed cursed. The flagellants there arose a sect of penitents called flagellants. Barefoot and clad in rags, they marched from town to town, scourging their own flesh with whips until blood ran. They sang hymns of sorrow, believing their pain might appease God's wrath. Crowds followed them, weeping, believing salvation near. Yet still the plague struck, filling flagella and follower alike. Their processions ended in silence. Scapegoats and pogroms, desperation breeds cruelty. The people, blinded by terror, sought scapegoats. Rumors spread that the Jews had poisoned wells or cursed the land. And so across Europe the innocent were slaughtered. In Strasbourg, thousands of Jews were herded into a wooden house and burned alive. In Mainz and Cologne, in countless towns, pogroms swept like fire. The plague slew without mercy, yet man found reason to add to the slaughter. The toll of the dead by the time the Black Death had passed. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of all Europe lay in graves. In some lands, the living could not bury the dead quickly enough. In others, entire villages vanished. The fields overgrown, the houses fallen to ruin. It is said that 75 to 100 million souls perished worldwide. Europe did not recover for generations. The shadow left behind when the pestilence at last retreated, Europe was not the same. Laborers became scarce, and the peasants, once downtrodden, found themselves in demand. Lords offered wages where once they offered whips. The old order trembled. Faith itself was shaken. How could God allow his flock to perish so? How could the saints stand silent? Some turned from the church while others clung to it with desperate fervor. The chronicler raised a trembling hand. Mark this well, children. Wars may wound the body, but plague wounds the very soul of a people. It was not swords that broke Europe, but silence, fear, and the endless toll of death. The chroniclers paused, the old man coughed, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. Think not, however, that war ceased while the plague raged. Men still slew one another even as death walked the land. For greed and zeal know no restraint, and the banner of Christ itself was carried into slaughter. He leaned forward, his voice low as a crackle of embers. And now I shall tell you of the Crusades, wars of faith that spilled more blood than any pestilence. The old chronicler sipped his ale, his hand trembling, though whether from age or the weight of memory none could tell. The tavern had grown utterly silent, even the fire seemed to burn softer, as though it too feared the tales yet to come. Children, the old man whispered, if pestilence was God's hand, and the Mongols were his scourge, then the Crusades were man's own madness. For men clothed themselves in the cross and called themselves holy, yet wielded the sword with a fury that spared neither sinner nor saint. Their battles were not merely wars of kingdoms, but wars of the soul. And in such wars, mercy dies first. The First Crusade, 1096-1099, rivers of blood in Jerusalem. It began with the words of Pope Urban II, who in 1095 declared, God wills it, let those who have been robbers now become soldiers of Christ. Let those who fought against their brothers now fight against the infidel. The promise was great, forgiveness of sins, wealth, and eternal glory. So peasants, knights, lords, and kings alike took the cross and marched eastward. But not all who marched were noble. The People's Crusade, a rabble of peasants and zealots, swept through the Rhineland before even reaching the Holy Land. Along their path, they fell upon Jewish communities in Mainz, Worms, and Cologne, massacring thousands in a frenzy of false piety. The Crusade of the Poor began with rivers of innocent blood. When at last the knights reached Jerusalem in 1099, their hunger and fury were unchained. After a brutal siege, the holy city fell. What followed was not sanctity but slaughter. Chroniclers wrote that the streets ran ankle deep in blood. Muslims and Jews alike were cut down, men, women, and children. Some were burned alive in their synagogues. A Christian eyewitness recorded with grim pride, in the temple and the porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridal reins. Jerusalem was purified, not with prayer but with massacre. The Second Crusade, 1147-1149, a holy failure word of the loss of Edessa, stirred a second call to arms. Kings Louis Rezévin of France and Conrad III of Germany led vast hosts into the east. Yet their armies, plagued by hunger and betrayal, found only ruin. At Damascus they faltered, retreating in shame. No holy triumph, only death and disgrace. The Muslims rejoiced while Europe mourned sons slain far from home. The Third Crusade, 1189-1192, Saladin and the Lionheart, but the greatest of crusades came when Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, struck and took Jerusalem in 1187 after the fateful Battle of Aten. The Christian armies were crushed, the knights captured, their relics seized. Saladin, unlike many before him, spared Jerusalem from slaughter, allowing Christians to depart with their lives. This mercy, rare in that age, was remembered with awe even among his foes. Yet Europe would not abide the loss of the holy city. And so came kings. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, Frederick Barbarossa of Germany. Though Barbarossa drowned in a river, Richard proved a fearsome foe. At Acre, Richard ordered the massacre of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners, men, women, and children, for ransom was not paid quickly enough. Their corpses were left beneath the walls as carrion for birds. Though Richard fought Saladin to a standstill, Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The Crusaders returned home, having drenched the sands of the Holy Land with yet more blood. The Fourth Crusade, 1204. The rape of Constantinople, if ever there was proof of the corruption of holy war, it was the Fourth Crusade. The knights intending to march on Jerusalem were lured by Venetian merchants into attacking Constantinople, the greatest Christian city of the East. In 1204, the Crusaders stormed its walls. They looted churches, desecrated holy relics, and violated nuns in their convents. The Hagia Sophia, jewel of Christendom, was stripped bare. For 3 days the city burned. Eastern Christians, meant to be brothers in faith, were butchered by those who bore the cross. This was no crusade but a crime, and it broke the unity of Christendom forever. The Northern and Children's Crusades. Not all crusades marched to Jerusalem. In the north, Christian knights waged war against the pagans of Prussia and the Baltic. They burned villages, slaughtered tribes, and baptized survivors with the sword at their throats. And then came the most tragic telltale, the Children's Crusade 1212. Thousands of youths, believing God would part the seas for them as once for Moses, marched southward. Few reached the coast. Many starved, others perished, and some were sold into slavery. Innocence itself was butchered upon the altar of fanaticism. The later Crusades and the fall of Acre, 1291, though many crusades followed, none reclaimed Jerusalem. The last great Christian stronghold in the east, the city of Acre, fell in 1291. When the Mamluks breached its walls, the defenders fought with desperate valor. Yet the slaughter was total. Crusaders and citizens alike were slain or enslaved. With Acre's fall, the dream of a Christian kingdom in the Holy Land was extinguished. The body count of faith, how many perished in these wars of the cross. No chronicler can say. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, were slain across 2 centuries of crusade. And not only Muslims but Jews, heretics, pagans, and even Christians. The chronicler's voice grew harsh. Remark this well, children. When men clothe their hatred in holiness, the sword cuts deeper and the blood flows longer. A fate twisted by zeal becomes more terrible than pestilence or the Mongol horde. The chronicler's reflection, the old man leaned back, his eyes heavy with sorrow. I have spoken of kings and knights, of sultans and popes, of banners raised in God's name. Yet what remains? Piles of corpses, empty cities, ashes where homes once stood. This is the true fruit of crusade. He coughed, his voice low as he turned the tale. Oh, but no, children, that holy war was not the last massacre of that age. For even as empires fell and plagues returned, there came a day when the greatest city of Christendom itself, Constantinople, was cast down, and blood drowned its streets. And so he prepared to tell of the fall of Constantinople, 1453. The fire in the tavern hearth had burned low. The old chronicler's face, carved with lines of years, glowed faintly in the dying embers. His listeners sat silent, peasants, travelers, and children alike, their bowls untouched, their mugs of ale forgotten. He drew his cloak tighter and his voice softened, carrying the weight of centuries. You have heard of the 100 Years' War, where kingdoms bled for crowns. You have heard of the Mongols, who thundered across the world like a storm of iron. You have heard of the Black Death, that invisible reaper who filled every churchyard. You have heard of the Crusades, where men clothed slaughter in the garments of holiness. And you have heard of Constantinople's fall, where the greatest walls of Christendom crumbled in fire and despair. What do these tales teach us, children? That kings may rise and fall, that banners may change, that even cities and empires may vanish, but death remains constant. War, pestilence, and massacre are but the masks it wears. He paused, staring into the last flickers of flame. Why do you not think these horrors are gone, confined to dusty chronicles? They return in every age, for as long as men hunger for power, as long as fear and zeal rule the heart. The shadow will walk beside us. The Middle Ages are past, yet the darkness of man's soul is timeless. The tavern was silent, save for the crackle of ash. Then the old man rose, leaning on his staff. He looked upon his listeners one final time, and with a weary sigh spoke his last words. Oh, pray, children. Pray that when death next marches, it finds you not in hatred but in peace. For war ends, plague retreats, and empires fall, but the memory of carnage endures as long as men remember. And with that, the chronicler stepped into the night, leaving behind only the smoke of the fire and the echo of his tales.